The Viking Age. Chapter 1. On the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of England, the year of our Lord 793 was one of quiet devotion. Within the stone walls of the priory, monks moved with a gentle rhythm of prayer and labour. In the scriptorium, the air was still, thick with the scent of ink and drying parchment. A brother, his head bowed in concentration, scraped a quill across a sheet of vellum, adding a line of gold leaf to an illuminated letter. The world for him was contained in this sacred act, a world of order, faith, and the enduring word of God. Outside, the cry of gulls and the gentle wash of the North Sea against the shore were the only sounds. The island was a beacon of Christian learning in a pagan world, a place of peace, protected, it was thought, by its sanctity and its isolation. But isolation is a matter of perspective. From the sea it is not a barrier, but an invitation. Beyond the horizon a new shape was appearing. Long and low in the water, with a single square sail of red and white stripes, it moved with an unnerving speed and purpose. At its prow a carved dragon's head stared forward, its wooden eyes seeming to scan the waves for prey. It was a vessel unlike any the monks had ever seen, a technology of terror born in the cold fjords of the north. And it was not alone. Before the fury there was the land. Scandinavia, in the 8th century, was a world apart. A rugged coastline of deep, winding fjords bit into a landscape of dense forests and high mountains. Communities were small, clustered in clearings or along the sheltered shores, separated by vast tracts of unforgiving wilderness. It was a society of farmers, fishermen, and chieftains, bound by kinship, honour, and a complex web of oaths. Their world was animated by old gods. Odin the All-Father, Thor the Thunderer, Freyja the Beautiful and Fierce. Their laws were not written in books, but spoken aloud at assemblies called things, where free men gathered to settle disputes and make decisions for the community. Power was local, held by the chieftain who could offer the most protection, the most treasure, and the most glory. For generations their ambitions had been turned inward or against their immediate neighbours, but the land was growing crowded. The best soil was already claimed, and the sons of chieftains looked for new ways to build their wealth and reputation. A man's worth was measured by the silver on his arm and the loyalty of the warriors at his back. To gain both, one had to venture out. The path to renown led not to the forest, but to the sea. What enabled this outward turn, what transformed local squabbles into an international phenomenon, was a masterpiece of engineering, the longship. It was the perfect instrument for the age it would create. Built of overlapping oak planks, a technique known as clinker construction, its hull was both remarkably strong and deceptively flexible, designed to ride with the waves rather than fight them. Its shallow draught was its genius. A longship could carry 40 or 50 warriors across the treacherous open ocean, yet it drew so little water that it could navigate far up shallow rivers, striking deep into the heart of unsuspecting lands. It needed no port, no deep harbour. Its crew could simply run it ashore on any sandy beach, leap out, and begin their work. It was a tool of trade, a vessel of exploration, and, above all, a weapon of terrifying surprise. The men who sailed these ships were not a single people, not an ethnicity in the way we understand it today. They were Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians, but the name that would echo through history described not who they were, but what they did. To go a Viking was a job description. It meant to go on an expedition, to seek fortune overseas. The line between a pirate, a trader, and a mercenary was often as blurry as the coastal fog. For decades this activity had been small in scale. A ship or two might trade with the Frisians or raid a Slavic village across the Baltic. But as the 8th century drew to a close, their gaze turned west, toward the rich, fragmented, and poorly defended kingdoms of the British Isles. The first tremor was felt in the year 787, in the southern kingdom of Wessex. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record kept by English monks, tells the story with an air of disbelief. 3 longships landed on the coast. The local royal official, the reeve, rode down to meet them, assuming they were merchants. The law codes of the Wessex king, written nearly a century earlier, had defined an invading army, a heer, as any hostile group of more than 35 men. The reeve likely saw a force of this size, but his mistake was one of protocol. He spoke to them, the Chronicle says, with an authoritative tone, intending to escort them to the king's town to pay the proper trading tolls. He did not know who they were, or the new rules by which they played. In response to his command, they drew their weapons and killed him. The Chronicle ends its entry with a chillingly prophetic line: "These were the first ships of Danishmen which sought the land of the English nation." It was a prelude. 6 years later, in 793, the storm broke in its full and terrible fury upon Lindisfarne. The monks in the scriptorium had no warning. The dragon prows appeared from the sea mist, and the Northmen were upon them. They were not merchants, they were not diplomats, they came for wealth, and they took it from the one place it was most concentrated and least defended, the house of God. They stormed the priory, cutting down the monks who stood in their way. They kicked over altars, tore golden crucifixes from the walls, and broke open jewel-encrusted chests containing the holy relics of saints. They took everything of value: the silver chalices, the golden plates, the illuminated gospels bound in precious metals. Some of the brothers they killed on the spot, others they bound and dragged away, destined to be sold as slaves. News of the attack sent a shockwave of horror through Christian Europe. Alcuin, a Northumbrian scholar at the court of the great king Charlemagne, wrote a letter of lamentation back to his homeland. "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race," he wrote. The church of St. Gero, Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples. To the devout, it seemed an act of profound sacrilege, a punishment from God himself. How could a holy place be so violated? To the Northmen, however, a monastery was simply a poorly guarded treasury. Their gods were gods of battle and struggle, not of meekness and forgiveness. They saw not sacrilege, but opportunity, and Lindisfarne proved that the opportunity was immensely profitable. It was the beginning. In the years that followed, the dragon ships became a constant, terrifying presence along the coasts of England, Ireland, and Francia. Yet the story of this era is not one of plunder alone. While some sailed west to raid, others sailed south and east to trade. At the dawn of the 9th century, a new kind of settlement began to grow on the southern edge of the Jutland Peninsula, in what is now Germany. It was called Hedeby. Positioned strategically on a narrow strip of land, Hedeby offered a shortcut. It allowed traders to haul their ships and goods a short distance overland, connecting the treacherous North Sea with the calmer waters of the Baltic. It was a gateway, a crossroads of cultures and commerce. Archaeological evidence reveals a bustling, planned town, with a grid of streets, small houses clustered tightly together, and workshops for skilled artisans. Its rise was no accident. In the year 808, the Danish king Godfred, a powerful and ambitious ruler, saw a rival. The nearby Slavic port of Rerich was also a thriving centre of trade. According to Frankish chronicles, Godfred led a force against the town, destroyed it, and forcibly moved its merchants to Hedeby. It was a calculated act of economic warfare, a king deliberately engineering the success of his own commercial hub by eliminating the competition. Hedeby flourished. Furs and slaves from the Slavic East were traded for silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate, silks from Byzantium, and wine from the Rhineland. By 825, the town had grown so important that it began to mint its own coins, a clear sign of its economic power and autonomy. It was a place where a man could make his fortune with a merchant scale as easily as with a warrior's axe. It reveals the other face of the Viking age, one of industry, connection, and sophisticated commerce. But the warrior's axe was never far from hand. As the 9th century progressed, the scale of raiding grew. The fleets became larger, the leaders more ambitious. They learned that the kingdoms of Europe, particularly the fractured empire of Charlemagne's heirs, were rich but vulnerable. They learned that fear was a powerful currency. In the year 845, a vast fleet of over 100 longships sailed up the river Seine, deep into the kingdom of West Francia. Their target was the city of Paris. They met the Frankish army and defeated it, hanging their prisoners in sight of the city walls. The king, Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, was faced with a terrible choice: watch his capital be sacked and burned, or buy the invaders off. He chose to pay. A massive tribute, a Danegeld, was collected, 7,000 pounds of silver and gold. It was a fortune. The Northmen took the payment, turned their ships around, and sailed away, leaving the city untouched. This event established a devastating precedent. It taught the Viking leaders that extortion could be even more profitable than raiding. Why risk a bloody battle for plunder, when a king would simply hand over his treasury in exchange for peace? It was a lesson they would apply again and again, refining the brutal art of protection money on a national scale. For decades the pattern continued. The fury from the sea would arrive with the spring thaw. Longships would appear off the coast, raid monasteries and towns, and then disappear before a royal army could be mustered. Sometimes they were bought off with silver. But it was a temporary solution. The payments only encouraged them to return, demanding more. They were learning the geography of their enemies, their political weaknesses, their patterns of defence. The seasonal raids were becoming a sustained, multi-generational enterprise. And then, in the autumn of 864, the watchers on the coast of East Anglia saw something new. It was not a handful of ships. It was not a raiding party of a few hundred men. It was a fleet, vast and dark against the horizon, larger than any that had come before. This was no summer raid for portable wealth. This was an army. A great army. They had not come to plunder and leave. They had come to stay. A new and far more terrible chapter was about to begin. Chapter 2. The character of the war changed in the autumn of 865. The great army that had gathered off the coast of East Anglia was not merely a larger version of what had come before. It was a different entity entirely, a coalition of war bands united by a single audacious purpose. This was an army of occupation. Its leaders, men whose names are now woven into legend, did not seek a quick payment of silver to be on their way. They sought land. They sought a permanent home, a kingdom of their own, carved from the green fields of England. Later storytellers would claim they were the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, come to avenge their father's death. But whatever personal motives fueled them, their strategy was one of cold geopolitical calculation. This was a campaign of conquest. Their first move revealed a profound understanding of their enemies' weakness. Landing in East Anglia, they made no immediate move to raid or plunder. Instead, they made a deal. The local king, desperate to avoid a confrontation, provided the army with horses. It was a simple transaction, but it fundamentally altered the nature of the conflict. The Northmen were no longer bound to the coasts and rivers. They were now a mobile cavalry, a swift and terrible force that could strike deep into the heart of the country, moving faster than any Anglo-Saxon feared could be mustered to meet them. With their newfound mobility, they rode north. The once mighty kingdom of Northumbria, fractured by internal strife, was their first target. In November of 866 they stormed the great port of Eforwick, the city we now call York. It was a prize of immense strategic value. A former Roman legionary fortress, a centre of trade, and the seat of an archbishop, York was the heart of northern England. The army took the city, and they did not leave. They fortified its walls, settled within its streets, and began to transform it. Eoforwic became Jorvik, the Viking capital of the north. This act sent a clear message to the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The invaders were not leaving with the spring thaw. They were building a state. From their new stronghold in Jorvik, they moved south, dismantling the kingdom of Mercia piece by piece. They fought battles, installed puppet kings, and absorbed territory. For years the army moved through the Midlands with an almost unstoppable momentum. By the winter of 871 they were confident enough to make their camp in London, on the very doorstep of the last unconquered kingdom, Wessex. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us they were paid to leave, a familiar echo of past arrangements. But it was a temporary reprieve. The army was simply consolidating its gains, preparing for the final push. It was here that the fate of England came to rest on the shoulders of one man. His name was Alfred. He was the fourth son of the King of Wessex, a man more inclined to books and prayer than to the brutal calculus of war. Yet circumstance had thrust him onto the throne, and he now faced the most formidable military force his people had ever known. The early years of his reign were a litany of defeats. The great army, now under the command of a king named Guthrum, pressed relentlessly into Wessex. They were disciplined, battle-hardened, and seemingly invincible. In the winter of 878 they launched a surprise attack, forcing Alfred and a small band of followers to flee into the desolate marshlands of Somerset. This was the lowest point for the Anglo-Saxons. Their king was a fugitive, hiding among the reed beds and swampy islands of Athelney. The last kingdom seemed poised to fall. It is from this desperate time that the legends of Alfred grew, tales of a king in disguise, taking refuge in a peasant's hut, so lost in thought about his kingdom's fate that he let the woman's cakes burn on the hearth. The story may be folklore, but it captures a profound truth. Alfred was pushed to the very edge of defeat, his cause seemingly lost. But in the marshes something shifted. Alfred did not surrender. He sent out messengers, rallying the militias from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. He was building a new army, one born not of royal command, but of a desperate will to survive. In the spring of that same year, he emerged from his hiding place. At a place called Edington, his newly gathered force met Guthrum's army. There, on a rolling chalk down, the two shield walls clashed. It was not a battle of brilliant cavalry charges or cunning manoeuvres. It was a brutal, grinding contest of endurance and will. For hours the two lines of men pushed and hewed at one another, the sound of axe on shield and sword on mail ringing across the hills. But Alfred's men, fighting for their homes, their families, and their very existence, held their ground. And then they began to push back. The Viking line broke. The great army, which had terrorized England for over a decade, was shattered. Alfred pursued them to their fortress at Chippenham and besieged them for 2 weeks. Finally, Guthrum surrendered. Yet Alfred's response was not one of simple vengeance. He understood that he could not destroy the Northmen, nor could he expel them. They were too numerous, too deeply embedded in the land. He needed a lasting peace. And so he offered Guthrum a treaty. The terms were both pragmatic and profound. Guthrum and his chief men would accept Christian baptism, with Alfred himself standing as godfather. In return, England would be formally divided. A line was drawn, running from the Thames estuary, up the River Lea to its source, then straight to Bedford, and up the River Ouse to the old Roman road of Watling Street. To the south and west lay Anglo-Saxon England, under the rule of Alfred. To the north and east lay the territory where Norse law and custom would hold sway. It would become known as the Danelaw. It was a landmark moment. The Viking army had failed to conquer all of England, but they had succeeded in their goal of winning a kingdom. They were no longer invaders. They were settlers, neighbours, a permanent part of the political and cultural landscape. The land takers had secured their land. While one Viking leader was becoming a Christian king in England, Another was carving out a different destiny on the banks of the Seine. For decades, the kingdom of West Francia had suffered the same pattern of raids and extortions as England. The Northmen knew the rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, as well as they knew their own fjords. Among the most feared of their leaders was a man named Rollo. He was a sea king of the old mould, a formidable warrior who commanded a large and loyal following. He and his forces had campaigned across the Frankish lands for years, and in 885 they joined a vast fleet to undertake their most ambitious project yet, the siege of Paris. For nearly a year, hundreds of longships blockaded the island city. The Vikings assaulted the walls, built siege engines, and tried to starve the defenders into submission. But Paris held. Its bridges and stone walls, defended with grim determination, proved too strong. The siege was a demonstration of Viking power and ambition, but it was also a strategic failure. It showed that even the largest army could be stopped by a well-defended city. The Franks, like the Anglo-Saxons, realized that they could not simply fight the Northmen into submission. The raids continued year after year, draining the treasury and terrorizing the countryside. The king, Charles, a man history would call the simple, not for a lack of intelligence, but for his straightforward nature, sought a different kind of solution. He needed to find a way to make the Northmen a part of the solution rather than the problem. He saw in Rollo not just a threat, but an opportunity. Here was a strong leader who could, perhaps, be persuaded to defend the coast against other Viking raiders. In the year 911, the king and the sea king met at a small town on the river Epte. There they forged an agreement that would change the course of European history. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-Sur. Epte was a masterpiece of political pragmatism. Charles offered Rollo a vast swath of land, from the river Epte to the sea, a territory that would soon bear the name of its new masters, Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In exchange, Rollo would do three things. He would swear an oath of fealty to King Charles, becoming his vassal. He would defend the kingdom from any further Viking attacks. And, like Guthrum in England, he would accept baptism and embrace the Christian faith. The deal was struck. Rollo, the pagan raider who had besieged Paris, knelt before the Frankish king. He placed his hands in the king's and pledged his loyalty. He was taken to the baptismal font and given the Christian name Robert. He was now a Frankish duke, a prince of the realm, bound by the intricate rules of feudal society. This was the final, most profound transformation. The Viking impulse, which had begun a century before with violent raids for portable wealth, had now evolved. In England, it had resulted in the creation of a hybrid society in the Danelaw. But in France, it produced something new entirely. The Northman had become a Norman. The land taker had become a lord, a kingmaker, whose descendants would one day cross the sea and claim the throne of England itself. The long journey from the fjord to the feudal court was complete. Chapter 3. In the year 922, on the banks of the great Volga River, the Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan stood as a witness to a scene of profound and terrible ceremony. He was a man of Baghdad, a city of science, poetry, and refined faith, sent on a mission to the distant Volga Bulgars. But here, far from the marbled courts of the Caliph, he encountered a different people entirely. They were the Rus tall as date palms, he wrote, with ruddy complexions and bodies marked by dark green patterns from nail to neck. He watched with a scholar's precision and a man's horrified fascination as they prepared a funeral for one of their chieftains. They laid the dead man in a temporary grave for 10 days while his grave goods were prepared. A slave girl, who had volunteered to join her master in the next world, was given intoxicating drinks and passed from man to man, singing as if in a joyful trance. Finally, they dragged one of the chieftain's longships ashore, building a pyre of wood within it. Upon this they placed a couch, and on the couch they laid the dead man, dressed in his finest silks and furs, surrounded by his weapons, by food and drink, and by the sacrificed bodies of his horses and dogs. Then came the girl, an old woman, whom the Rus called the Angel of Death, guided her to the ship. The girl looked back at her people, smiled a final haunting farewell, and was lifted aboard. She was given a final drink, and as she sang, two men strangled her with a rope, while the old woman plunged a broad-bladed dagger between her ribs again and again. The chieftain's nearest kinsman then walked backwards, naked, holding a flaming torch. He touched it to the pyre. The flames caught quickly, roaring to life, consuming the ship, the chieftain, the girl, and all their earthly possessions in a column of fire and smoke. One of the Rus, standing beside the stunned diplomat, explained the ritual's meaning. "You Arabs," he said, "are fools. You take the people you love most and cast them into the earth to be eaten by worms. We burn them in an instant, so that they may enter paradise at once." Ibn Fadlan meticulously recorded what he saw. His account, rediscovered centuries later, provides a rare, unflinching gaze from the outside into the world of the Eastern Vikings. It was a world far removed from the Danelaw of England or the new Duchy of Normandy. While their cousins in the west were taking land and forging new identities as Christian lords, these Northmen had turned their prows not to the open Atlantic, but down the vast winding river roads of the east. They followed a different path, the Ost of Geir, the Eastern Way. For decades, these Swedes, known to the Slavs and Byzantines as the Rus or the Varangians, had been a presence on the river systems of what would one day become Russia and Ukraine. They were merchants and mercenaries, driven by the lure of Arab silver and Byzantine gold. From their trading posts at Staraya Ladoga and Novgorod, they would haul their ships overland between watersheds connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black and Caspian Seas. Their journeys were epics of endurance. They paddled and sailed down the Dnieper, navigating treacherous rapids that forced them to unload their cargo and carry their ships and goods for miles. They fought off attacks from nomadic Pecheneг horsemen who stalked the riverbanks. They travelled down the Volga, deep into the lands of the Khazars and the Bulgars, to the great markets where east met north. They brought the treasures of the northern forests, the lustrous pelts of sable and marten, amber from the Baltic shores, honey, wax, and walrus ivory. And they brought human cargo. Slavic captives sold as slaves in the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. In return they received what they craved most, silver dirhams minted in the Islamic world, which they hoarded, melted down, and wore as symbols of status. And they brought back fine silks, spices, and wine from the legendary city the Norse called Miklagard, the great city, Constantinople. Their relationship with the Byzantine Empire was complex, a mixture of violent assault and calculated negotiation. They had attacked the city, but they had also signed treaties. As early as 874, a formal agreement obliged the Rus to provide soldiers for Byzantine military service. These Norsemen, loyal only to the emperor who paid them, were seen as ideal bodyguards, utterly detached from the treacherous court politics of the Eastern Roman Empire. By 902, they were serving as marines on Byzantine warships. This was the seed of what would later become the most famous elite unit in the medieval world, the Varangian Guard. The Eastern Way was not just a trade route, it was a career path for ambitious warriors seeking fortune in the service of an emperor. While the Rus were building trade networks and serving foreign masters, a profoundly different Scandinavian society was taking shape on a remote island in the North Atlantic. It was a society founded not on the pursuit of imperial gold, but on the rejection of royal power. The sagas, the great prose epics written in Iceland centuries later, tell a story of origin rooted in defiance. They speak of a king in Norway, Haraldr, known as Fairhair, who around the year 872 vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he had become the sole ruler of the land. After a great victory at the Battle of Hafrsfjord, he succeeded, uniting the petty kingdoms of Norway under his iron-fisted rule. He imposed taxes and demanded oaths of fealty, challenging the traditional authority of the local chieftains or jarls. To many of these proud, independent men, submitting to a king was an intolerable insult. For generations, their families had ruled their own fjords, accountable to no higher power. Faced with the choice of submission or death, they chose a third option, exile. They packed their households, their livestock, and their followers into their longships and set sail west across the open ocean, seeking a new home where they could live according to the old ways. Modern historians debate the literal truth of the Harold Fairhair story, suggesting it may be a simplified origin myth. The reasons for the exodus were likely more complex: overpopulation, disputes over land, and the simple, restless urge for adventure. But the story the Icelanders told themselves is what matters. They saw themselves as a people who had chosen freedom over tyranny. They found their freedom on a vast volcanic island of ice and fire, Iceland. Here there was no king to bow to. Each chieftain established his own farmstead, his own small domain. But they recognized the need for a system to resolve disputes and maintain order. And so, in the year 930, they gathered at a place called Ingvalir, the Assembly Plains, a dramatic rift valley carved by the shifting of tectonic plates. There, under an open sky, they founded the Althing, a national parliament. It was a remarkable political innovation. For 2 weeks every summer, chieftains and free farmers from across the island would travel to the Althing. They camped on the plains, traded goods, arranged marriages, and celebrated. But at the heart of the gathering was the law rock, the Logberg. Here, a chosen law speaker would recite 1/3 of the nation's laws from memory each year. Men brought their grievances to be judged by their peers. They created a commonwealth, a free state, bound not by the authority of a king or a warlord, but by a shared commitment to the law. It was an assembly of equals, a radical experiment in self-governance in an age of rising kings. Back in the Scandinavian homelands, the age of kings was not just rising, it was consolidating. While the Icelanders were building a society without a monarch, the Danes were forging a powerful, unified kingdom. The man responsible was a king named Harold, son of Gorm the Old. He would be known to history as Harold Bluetooth. Harold inherited a kingdom, but he forged a nation. He was a builder, constructing a network of massive circular fortresses known as Trelleborgs to project his royal power across the land. He was a conqueror, extending his rule over Norway, just as the Icelandic sagas had claimed Harold Fairhair had done a century before. And he was a convert. Under pressure from the powerful Holy Roman Empire to his south, and perhaps through the work of a missionary named Poppo, who, legend says, carried a red-hot piece of iron to prove the power of his God, Harold embraced Christianity. And he made sure the world knew it. Around the year 965, at the royal seat of Jelling, he raised a monumental stone, a granite testament to his achievements. It stands there still, a 3-sided stone covered in intricate carvings and runes. On one face is the image of a great beast, a lion entwined with a serpent. On another, the earliest Scandinavian depiction of Christ, arms outstretched as if on the cross, but entangled in the flowing ribbons of Norse art. But the most powerful statement is in the inscription, a bold declaration carved in the stone for all to see. It reads, "King Harold ordered this monument made in memory of Gorma, his father, and in memory of Thurva, his mother, that Haraldur who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian." This was more than a gravestone. It was a birth certificate for a nation. It declared the end of the old ways, the dawn of a new Christian kingdom, and the supreme authority of the king who had created it. The worlds of the independent chieftain and the pagan gods were fading, being replaced by centralized monarchies and the cross. This new order of kings, laws, and a single God had little room for men of the old mould. men like Eric the Red. Eric was an exile twice over. His father had been banished from Norway for manslaughter, settling his family in the rugged west of Iceland. But Eric had inherited his father's violent temper. He became embroiled in a series of bloody feuds with his neighbours over land and livestock. Men were killed. The delicate legal balance of the Icelandic Commonwealth could not tolerate such bloodshed. The local assembly, and then the Althing itself, declared Eric an outlaw. He was banished from Iceland for 3 years. He was a man without a home. Norway was ruled by a king. Iceland, the land of the free, had cast him out. But Eric had heard stories, sailors, tales of a vast land far to the west, sighted by a man named Gunnbjorn, who had been blown off course decades earlier. It was a land of myth, a rumour on the edge of the known world. For a man with nowhere else to go, a rumour was enough. In the year 982, Eric the Red gathered his family and his few remaining followers. He provisioned his ship, and he pointed its prow west into the cold, empty expanse of the North Atlantic. He was sailing away from the new worlds the Vikings were building, the Christian kingdoms of Scandinavia, the river empires of the Rus, even the legalistic Republic of Iceland. He was sailing in search of a final refuge for the Viking spirit, a place where a man could still be his own master. He was sailing toward a shore of ice, a land he would one day give a deceptively gentle name, hoping to lure others to his last frontier. Chapter 4. The keel of the longship grated against the shore, a sound no European ear had ever heard on this continent. The men who stepped out, their boots sinking into the damp sand, were not conquerors arriving with fire and steel. They were explorers, weary from the sea, their faces etched by the North Atlantic wind. Around them the world was a tapestry of unfamiliar green. This was a silent, profound moment, lost to all but the sagas that would remember it. 500 years before the caravels of Columbus would follow the sun, Leif, son of Eric, stood on a new world. The air was mild, the rivers teemed with salmon, larger than any they had seen in Greenland, and wild grapes grew so thick on the vine that Leif would name this place Vinland, the land of wine. It was the farthest point of a journey that had begun not in a king's court, but in the heart of an exile. This ultimate voyage was only possible because of the stubborn vision of Leif's father. Eric the Red, cast out from Iceland, had made a home on the edge of the known world. Around the year 986, having spent his years of exile charting the coast of a vast ice-bound land to the west, he returned to Iceland not as a penitent outlaw, but as a promoter. He spoke of a place he called Greenland, a name chosen with a trader's cunning. It was a marketing tactic designed to lure settlers to a land where ice, not grass, was the dominant feature, and it worked. A flotilla of 25 ships set out from Iceland, carrying families and livestock, hopes and dreams toward Eric's new colony. Only 14 would complete the perilous journey. They established 2 settlements on the sheltered western coast, a precarious foothold for European life, sustained by farming in the short summer and hunting the seals and walrus of the sea. For a time, this remote community thrived, a testament to Norse resilience. It was from this final, lonely outpost that the leap into the true unknown was made. Yet, as Eric and Leif pushed the boundaries of the physical world, the spiritual world they had known was contracting. Back in Norway, a new kind of king was forging a new kind of kingdom, not with the slow consensus of the Althing, but with the swift, unyielding edge of the sword. Olaf Tryggvason, a former raider who had converted to Christianity abroad, returned to claim the Norwegian throne in 995. His was a faith born of political ambition. He saw in the cross what men like Harald Bluetooth had seen in Denmark, a tool for unification, a way to break the power of the old chieftains and their local gods. Olaf's conversion of Norway was not a gentle persuasion. It was a campaign of force. Chieftains were given a stark choice: baptism or death. He broke their idols, burned their sacred groves, and built the first churches on their ruins. The old world of Odin and Thor did not fade quietly. It was violently extinguished by a king who wielded his new religion as a weapon of statecraft. This combination of outward ambition and internal consolidation reached its zenith in the figure of one of the most remarkable rulers of the age. He was a man who embodied the final, most sophisticated evolution of the Viking spirit, from raider to conqueror to emperor. His name was Canute, known to history as Canute the Great. The son of the Danish king Svein Forkbeard, who had briefly conquered England himself, Canute returned in N15 to reclaim his father's prize. This was no mere raid. It was a methodical, brutal war of conquest. For more than a year, his armies harried the English countryside, culminating in the decisive Battle of Assundoun in 1016. There, Canute's Danish forces shattered the English army, and a treaty was forged in the aftermath. England was partitioned, but soon after, the English king, Edmund Ironside, died. By 1017, Canute was the undisputed king of all England. What followed was not the reign of a foreign tyrant, but a masterclass in statesmanship. Canute understood that an empire built only on fear could not last. He sent most of his great army home, keeping a professional force of housecarls as his bodyguard. He embraced English laws and customs, upheld the rights of the Church, and presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate Christian king. He brought peace and, with it, prosperity. The Danish warrior became a pillar of European stability. His ambition did not end there. By 118, he was also King of Denmark. A decade later, he had driven the King of Norway into exile and added that kingdom to his domain. From his court in England, Canute presided over a vast North Sea empire, a Scandinavian dominion that stretched from the British Isles to the Baltic. He was, for a time, the most powerful ruler in northern Europe, a Viking king who commanded not a fleet of longships, but a sophisticated international political network. The old sagas tell a famous story of him placing his throne on the seashore and commanding the tide not to rise. When the waves inevitably washed over his feet, he declared to his courtiers that the power of kings was empty and worthless compared to the power of the God who commands the heavens and the sea. It was the act of a man who understood both the vastness of his power and its ultimate limits. While Canute was building his empire, other Northmen were seeking their fortunes in a different, though no less dangerous, arena. The Viking spirit of the adventurer, the freebooter, the man who lives by his wits and his sword, found its ultimate expression in the life of a Norwegian prince named Harald Sigurdsson. History would remember him as Harald Hardrada, Harald the Hard Ruler. Forced into exile after a failed attempt to claim the Norwegian throne, Harald, still a teenager, began a journey that would become legendary. He travelled the river roads of the Rus, eventually arriving at the golden heart of the known world, Miklagard, the great city of Constantinople. There he and his followers joined the Byzantine emperor's most elite unit, the Varangian Guard. For more than a decade, Harald served the empire, fighting its battles in Sicily, Bulgaria, and the Holy Land. He was not merely a soldier, he was a commander, a strategist, and a relentless accumulator of wealth. The sagas speak of the immense fortune he gathered through plunder and imperial pay, which he dutifully sent north for safekeeping. He saw the inner workings of the world's most complex court, survived its deadly intrigues, and emerged as one of the most famous and feared warriors of his time. When he finally left Constantinople, he was a man transformed, a Viking who had mastered the arts of war and politics on a global stage. He returned to Norway in 1045, his Byzantine gold buying him a share of the kingdom. Soon he would be its sole ruler. The wandering mercenary had come home a king. But empires, whether built by statesmen or adventurers, are fragile things. Cnut's great North Sea Empire dissolved soon after his death in 1035. His sons lacked his vision and his strength, and the crowns of England, Denmark, and Norway were once again separated. In England, the throne eventually returned to the old Anglo-Saxon line, to a king who had spent his own youth in exile. His name was Edward, later known as the Confessor. Edward's reign was long and, for the most part, peaceful. He was a pious man, more interested in the church than in the battlefield. He built the great Westminster Abbey, a monument to his faith that would outlast his kingdom. But in his devotion he neglected one crucial duty of a king. He failed to produce an heir. As the years passed, the question of the succession loomed ever larger over the kingdom. The great men of the realm watched the aging, childless king and began to make their plans. By the time the cold winter of 1065 settled over the land, King Edward was fading. His death would not leave a quiet absence. It would create a vacuum, a void into which the ambitions of the most powerful men in Europe would rush. Three claimants eyed the English throne. In England there was Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, the most influential man in the kingdom. Across the Channel in Normandy, Duke William, the descendant of the Viking Rollo, believed the throne had been promised to him. And in the north, the old warrior king, Harald Hardrada of Norway, saw his chance to reclaim Cnut's imperial crown and restore the glory of the North Sea Empire. The stage was being set. The long Viking age was drawing to its dramatic and violent close. Chapter 5. In the late summer of the year 1066, a wind from the north began to blow across England. It carried with it the scent of salt and pine and the cold ambition of an old king. More than 300 ships, a forest of masts and painted dragon brows, sailed with that wind, leaving the fjords of Norway behind. They entered the mouth of the river Humber, a river of ships flowing inland, their square sails a stark geometry against the gentle English landscape. This was the fleet of Harold Sigurdsson, known to history as Hardrada, the hard ruler. He was the last of the great Viking warrior kings, a man who had fought for emperors in the golden city of Constantinople and had returned home to claim a crown. Now he had come to claim another. He was not alone. At his side sailed Tosti Godwinson, the estranged and exiled brother of the new English king. Together they represented the final great gamble of the Viking Age, an attempt to reclaim the North Sea Empire of Canute and turn England once and for all into a Scandinavian kingdom. Their first test came at Fulford Gate, just outside the city of York. The northern English earls, loyal to their new king, met the Norwegian host. The battle was a brutal, grinding affair, fought in the mud of a riverbank. But the experience of Hardrada's veterans, men hardened by decades of war, proved decisive. The English shield wall broke. The northern army was shattered. York, the old Viking capital of Jorvik, opened its gates to the conqueror. For a fleeting moment it seemed the dream of a northern empire was alive once more. But 4 days later, as the Norwegian army rested near a wooden crossing on the river Derwent called Stamford Bridge, the world changed. They had left much of their armour with the ships, expecting only to receive tribute from the surrounding countryside. The day was warm, the mood relaxed. Then a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, glittering with the points of spears and the steel of helmets. King Harold Godwinson of England had done the impossible. Hearing of the invasion, he had force-marched his army nearly 200 miles in just 4 days. He had caught the last great Viking army completely by surprise. What followed was not a battle so much as a slaughter. According to tradition, a single towering Norwegian warrior held the narrow bridge alone, felling Englishman after Englishman with his great axe, buying precious time for his king to form a line. Only when a soldier was floated in a barrel under the bridge to spear him from below did the English army finally cross. The Vikings, fighting without their mailcoats, were terribly vulnerable. They formed a circle of shields, a desperate, dwindling ring of defiance. In the centre stood their king, Harold Hardrada, a giant of a man, fighting with a fury born of a lifetime of violence. But his luck, which had carried him from the rivers of Russia to the shores of Sicily, had finally run out. An English arrow found his throat. He fell, and with him fell the Viking dream of England. The last great Viking invasion was over. King Harold Godwinson had no time to savour his victory. He had destroyed one rival, but another was waiting. As his exhausted army celebrated in York, the winds in the English Channel, which had held for weeks, finally shifted. On the coast of Normandy, Duke William gave the order. Hundreds of ships, packed with thousands of knights, archers, and foot soldiers, set sail. They were the descendants of Rollo's Northmen, but they were no longer Vikings. 2 centuries in France had transformed them. They were now Normans, feudal, Christian, French-speaking, and masters of a new kind of warfare, built on the disciplined charge of armoured cavalry. Harold, learning of the new invasion, rushed his battered army south once more. He gathered what men he could and took up a defensive position on a ridge near the small town of Hastings. On the morning of October 14th, 1066, the two armies faced each other. It was a clash of worlds. The Anglo-Saxons, with their Danish housecarls at the core, stood shoulder to shoulder, their long kite shields interlocked to form the classic shield wall, the ancient, formidable defensive tactic of the Germanic and Norse peoples. Below them, the Normans arrayed their forces, archers, infantry, and the armoured knights on their war horses. For hours the battle raged. The Norman cavalry charged up the slope again and again, only to break like waves against the unyielding rock of the English shield wall. At one point, a rumour spread that Duke William had been killed, and the Norman attack faltered. But William rode along the lines, lifting his helmet to show his face, rallying his men. The battle turned on exhaustion and strategy. The English, tired from 2 battles and 2 long marches, began to lose discipline. Feigned retreats by the Norman cavalry lured small groups of them from the high ground, who were then cut down in the open. As the autumn sun began to sink, William ordered his archers to fire high, to let their arrows rain down from above. One of those arrows, as the story is told, struck King Harold in the eye. He fell, and as he did, the heart of the English defence was broken. The shield wall disintegrated. The Normans surged up the hill, and by nightfall the last Anglo-Saxon king of England and his brothers lay dead on the field. The Viking descendant had conquered the kingdom that had defeated the last Viking king. The Battle of Hastings was more than just the end of a dynasty. It was the end of an era. The Norman conquest fundamentally remade England. The Anglo-Saxon and Norse aristocracy was swept away, replaced by a French-speaking elite. They built stone castles, great cathedrals, and imposed a rigid feudal system upon the land. The English language itself was transformed, absorbing thousands of French and Latin words, creating the hybrid tongue we speak today. In a deep and profound irony, the final, lasting Scandinavian influence on England came not from the dragon ships of Norway, but from the descendants of those Vikings who had settled in France and become something new. While this new chapter was being written in blood and stone in England, other older chapters of the Viking story were quietly drawing to a close. Far to the west, in the vast cold emptiness of the North Atlantic, the Norse colony in Greenland was beginning its slow, inexorable decline. For centuries the descendants of Eric the Red had clung to the edges of the great ice cap, farming the green fjords, hunting seals, and trading walrus ivory with Europe. But the world was changing. The climate, which had been warm enough to allow for their settlement, began to cool. The Little Ice Age was setting in. The sea ice grew, making the perilous journey from Norway and Iceland ever more difficult. The market for walrus ivory collapsed as cheaper elephant ivory began to flow from Africa. Isolated and impoverished, the Greenlanders slowly faded. Their diet shifted, their health declined. The last written record from the colony is a note of a wedding. held at Havalsi Church in the year 1408. After that, there is only silence. When visitors arrived again centuries later, they found only the haunting stone ruins of farms and churches, the graves of a people who had reached the edge of the world and then vanished. In the East, the end was not one of violence or lonely decline, but of absorption. The Russ, the Swedish Vikings who had given their name to a future empire, slowly merged with the Slavic peoples they ruled. They adopted Slavic names, Slavic language, and the Orthodox Christian faith of their Byzantine allies. By the 12th century, the ruling class of the Kievan Rus was indistinguishable from its subjects. The Norse identity had dissolved, becoming a foundational element of a new Slavic civilization, a ghost in the machine of Russian history. The Viking age, it seemed, had ended. The great sea kings were gone. The dragon ships rotted on the shore. The stories of their deeds, of raids and empires, of discoveries in the west and service in the east, retreated into the realm of myth, preserved only in the poetic and often fantastical sagas written down by Icelandic scholars centuries later. For generations, the story of Vinland, the land of wine and meadows discovered by Leif Erikson, was considered just that, a story, a heroic fiction. Then, in the 1960s, a Norwegian husband and wife team, the explorer Helge Ingstad and the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, followed the clues hidden in those old texts. The sagas described a place with a distinct cape, an island, and a shallow bay. They led them to the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, to a place called Lonze Oaks Meadows. There, overlooking the sea, they found a series of subtle, grass-covered ridges in the soil that did not look natural. They began to dig. Patiently, carefully, they uncovered the remains of 8 turf-walled buildings. The layout, with the great hall and smaller surrounding rooms, was unmistakably Norse. They found a smithy with slag and a stone anvil, evidence of ironworking, a technology unknown to the native peoples of the time. They found a bronze cloak-pin of a distinct Scandinavian design. The evidence was overwhelming. This was a Norse settlement, but the final definitive proof was something much smaller, much quieter. It was a small circular piece of soapstone, a spindle whorl, used for spinning yarn. It was an object of domestic life, a tool of a Norse woman left behind 1,000 years ago. This small, unassuming stone, unearthed from the cold Canadian soil, did more than any sword or helmet ever could. It proved that the sagas were not just myths. It confirmed that these people had not only reached this new world, but had tried to make a home in it. It was a quiet testament to the full scope of their world, a world that stretched from the river roads of Russia to the shores of North America. The Viking Age may have ended in the fire and chaos of 1066, but its legacy is woven into the fabric of the modern world. It lives in the borders of nations, in the words of our language, in the DNA of peoples from Dublin to Kiev. It survives in the democratic traditions of the Icelandic Althing, and in the ruins of a Greenland farmstead slowly sinking back into the earth. It is a story not just of warriors, but of farmers, traders, poets, and explorers. And it is a story that reminds us that history is not always found in the grand chronicles of kings and battles, but sometimes it is held in a single, simple object, a thread of truth, connecting us across 1,000 years of silence to the people who dared to sail beyond the edge of the map. Conclusion echoes in the ice. To look back upon the Viking Age is to gaze into a world of stark and beautiful contradictions. It was an age of brutal violence and sophisticated artistry, of pagan fatalism and the slow, inexorable spread of a new faith. It was an age of daring exploration that pushed the boundaries of the known world, and of quiet farming that sustained communities in some of the harshest landscapes imaginable. The Northmen were the terror of Europe, the fury from the sea. Yet they were also merchants who connected civilizations, mercenaries who guarded emperors, and lawgivers who founded one of the world's first parliaments. Their story is a powerful reminder of how a society on the periphery, driven by a combination of internal pressures and technological innovation, the magnificent longship can erupt onto the world stage and change it forever. They were not a monolithic people, but a diverse collection of communities whose journeys took them down vastly different paths. Some sought silver and slaves, others sought land and freedom. Some became kings, others became colonists. In England, they became the catalyst for a new nation. In France, they became the Normans. In Russia, they became the Rus. In Iceland and Greenland, they became a people, defined by their relationship with the land and the sea. And in the end, their age did not so much vanish as it transformed. It was absorbed into the kingdoms they had helped to create, their unique identity dissolving into the broader currents of European history. What remains is a legacy of resilience, adaptation, and a profound, restless human spirit. The echoes of their longships can still be heard in the crash of the North Atlantic waves, and the ghosts of their settlements still linger in the wind-swept meadows at the edge of the world, a testament to a time when the path to the future was an uncharted course leading west into the setting sun.